This Shabbat Hagadol drasha is called, the Haggadah is Unfolding Covenant, Partnership, Presence, and Potential. And if you take a look at your source sheets on that first page, in the middle paragraph is Vihisha Amda. And at my parents' Seder, the Vihisha Amda was really the central piece. Vihisha Amda Lavotenu. And this is what kept our fathers, our mothers alive. Shelo echad bilvad. Amar aleinu lechalotenu. B'chol dovado omdim aleinu lechalotenu. V'akadosh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam. So in the shiur I would sing Vihisha Amda, but my time is limited. I'm going to move forward. The big question is, when it says Vihisha Amda, and this is what kept us eternally alive, what is this is? What does it refer to? And there are all kinds of thoughts, depending upon the Haggadah that you're reading. Some suggest that it's based on the numerical value of each of the letters of Vihi. Vav is 6, that's the Shisha Starim, the Shas. Hey is Chamisha Chumshei Torah. The Yud is the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. The Aleph is the one belief in God. It's a very sweet drasha, but it's not the Pshat. Vihi, I'm sorry?
Where is this drasha?
It's found
around.
in many. It's found around. It's so found that I can't even attribute it. But it's very sweet. Okay. I want to encourage you to say it. But it's not the Pshat. The Pshat is that Vihi is a conjunctive. And what it's saying is, and this, referring to the previous paragraph, whatever the theme of the previous paragraph, is what has sustained us. And in the previous paragraph, it's Baruch Shomei Avtachato L'Yisrael Amo. Blessed be the one who keeps the covenant, who keeps the promise made to Israel. Baruch Hu. Shakadosh Baruch Hu Chishev et Haketz. God calculated the end of time. Here it's the end of bondage, but God calculated the end of bondage, or more broadly, the moment of redemption. Lasot Kimo Shamal Avram Avinu, to do as he told Avram, Bivrit Ben Abtarim. In the covenant of the pieces, Shenema, and then 2 sentences from Breshit Tetvav, from Genesis 15. Clearly, what is the central theme of that paragraph? It's Brit. That God keeps the promise to Am Yisrael, as God tells Avram Avinu in the Brit Ben Abtarim. The next paragraph, Vihisha Amda Lavotenu, and it is this Brit that has sustained us and will sustain us eternally. And that's my goal. My goal in this Shabbat Hagadol discourse, in this shiur, is to try to analyze Brit. What is it about Brit which is so powerful that it is that which is it has sustained us and will sustain us eternally? And we'll be discussing Brit from what can be called the 3 P's. Brit as partnership, Brit as presence, and then Brit as potential. I believe I may have touched on a few of these pieces, and those pieces I'm going to run through more quickly, but I want you to see it in its totality, and I hope it will be of meaning. And the whole talk will be available, because it's really written out, so you can look back at it, and I hope you'll find some meaning in it. What is Brit? Brit is basically a contract. It's a contract between God and his people. And what does the contract deal with? The contract deals with the conditions necessary for redemption to come. What is a contract? A contract is, I sit down with you, Ruth, we sign a contract, you need signatories in the contract, correct? You need signatories. Now, but in the contract, there are going to be certain provisions. And that's what a Brit is. Brit is, we're the signatories, Am Yisrael with God. Sometimes it's humankind with God, sometimes it's individual. But for now, Am Yisrael with God. And what is the substance of the Brit? What is the substance of the contract, of the Brit? This is the journey. This is the blueprint through which one comes to that point of Geula. This is serious stuff. That's why Brit, covenant, is such an important word. It's a word which is used and overused, but it's a word that really requires a lot of discussion, and God willing, you're going to be entering into spiritual leadership, and this is a piece you should be able to talk about, and you should be talking about to your congregations and universities and your schools, wherever God is going to bless you to be. This is what I'm about ready to present is, I hope, will be food for thought and something of meaning not only for yourselves but to the communities that you're going to be serving. So let me explain and flesh this out a little bit more. Brit is contract between God and Am Yisrael. That is the blueprint. It is the journey towards redemption. It is a joint effort, as I've been saying, between God and Am Yisrael, God and humankind. When God creates the world imperfectly. This is a fundamental concept. You can give it any philosophical overview you wish. Just to touch on a few pieces. If everything were good, Rav Kook writes, if everything were good, nothing would be good, because good is a relative term. Rav Dessler writes in his piece on Gan Eden, he says, the human being who is unchallenged is not a human being. That person is angelic. It's not a person. In a world which is perfect, we're unchallenged. Or in a world where if it's so good that I can only do good, then I have no freedom of choice. Rav Chaim Volozhin talks a lot about this. There's no freedom of choice, he writes in the Nefesh HaChaim. So purposefully, God creates an incomplete and an imperfect world. And in the last word of the creation story, God says, the last thing God creates is Shabbat, Asher bara Elokim lasot. The God of Vayas Elokim, the God of creation, says to all of humankind, in his last word, lasot. The world is incomplete and imperfect, and now you, in partnership with me, uppercase, God says, let us complete, let us perfect, let us redeem the world. That's the partnership. In the beginning of time, it's with humankind. When you look further into Torah, for example, when God speaks about Avraham in the story of stone, Bereshit Perek Yudchet, he really puts forth the mission of Yadut. This is specifically to Am Yisrael. V'shamru derech Hashem, to God, to observe, to protect the way of God. Lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. Again, that word lasot. Whenever you find lasot, think about this partnership. Lasot is the mandate, the command from God to us to partner with God to redeem the world. Now, there's a partnership. But how much the Jewish people and God contribute to this partnership is part of the core idea of Brit. Now, I've discussed this with you in the past, haven't I? And basically, what have I said to you? What's the measure of how much God is involved and how much we're involved? So my contention is that the degree of input depends upon the historical maturity of the Am. In our infancy, when we're first born, God exercises unilateral authority over Jewish history. As we grow and develop, more is expected of us. It's something like a parent-child relationship. There is no more vulnerable being than the human species at birth. All other species at birth is more capable of defending itself than the human species. That moment, parents are unilaterally giving to children, to the infant child, to the child who's just emerged from its mother. But as the child grows, the child assumes more responsibility. This past Shabbat in Bet Knesset, I hope you have the opportunity to preside over such ceremonies. Abba and Ima came forward, and they were asked to say the Baruch Shabbat Torani. It's a tough blessing. What do they say? What is Baruch Shabbat Torani? in a certain sense, what's easy about love is holding on. What's tough about love is letting go. When you let go, it means I have a certain trust in you. I don't want to control you. I want to empower you. So the Baruch Shabbat Torani is a parent who is saying to a child, and now you are assuming more responsibility. That's the way it is in the human encounter. The child is growing to adulthood, taking upon herself, himself, more commitments, and ultimately even more responsibilities. This is the story of Jewish history. In the beginning of time, God acts unilaterally towards Am Yisrael. As Am Yisrael matures, the onus shifts as we assume greater responsibility and we act to help ourselves. Perhaps this is the reason in the Pesach Haggadah, whose name is basically missing. Which name is missing from the Haggadah? Moshe. In some Haggadot, he's found sort of as a continuation of a sentence, but that's just the Vagome. His name is not in the Haggadah. To the degree that on the Pasuk Vayotzienu Adonai miMitzrayim, so we learn in the Haggadah, Lo al yedei malach, v'lo al yedei saraf, v'lo al yedei shaliach, ela kadosh baruch hu b'chvodo u'v'yatzmo. Who took us out of Egypt? At the beginning of Jewish peoplehood, God and God alone plays the central role. We're not in a position to help ourselves. However, in Megillat Esther, which is also a physical battle, there is the reverse. That records our victory over Amalek, over Haman. There, it's lehefech. God's name is not mentioned at all. Sure, you can push the Torah, HaMelech is God. But in the Megillah, when you look at it, the name God doesn't appear. Why not? Having matured, the Jewish nation takes an active role in determining its fate. Now, the Sfat Emet, the Ger Rebbe, and I want to encourage you, whenever you can, to learn a little bit Sfat Emet. There's no one like him. Expands this idea and claims that all of the biblical holidays, all the Shalosh Regalim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, they are God-initiated and God-nurtured. In contrast, the rabbinical holidays like Chanukah, Purim, I would add, what would I add? Yom Ha'atzmaut, of course, which evolved thousands of years later, they are initiated and nurtured by Am Yisrael. Much like covenant, which over time demands that humans assume greatest responsibility, the holidays move from being God created to being man or woman created. Let's take a look at the Sfat Emet. Take a look at this back second page on your sheets. Let's take a look at it inside very, very quickly. Do you have it there?
Yeah, we have it.
Okay. Could you read it for me, please?
Sure. It's B under furniture.
Okay.
Do you want me to read in Hebrew?
Yeah.
Okay. השלושה מועדות שנתן לנו הקדוש ברוך הוא הם תורה שבכתב שמפורשים בתורה והקדוש ברוך הוא נתן לנו זמני קודש אשר נקדשנו בעת הבריאה שהכל בתורה נברא.
And you can see the translation. This is actually Art Green's translation. The three festivals God gave us are commanded expressly in the written Torah. God gave us those holy times sanctified since creation, for all was created through the Torah. They bear witness that that the Blessed Holy One has chosen Israel and is close to them, giving them his holy testimony. The word moed used for these holidays is related to edut, testimony. Really very, very, very powerful. I actually, if I may, I think the translation should be that the first Moadot, it's not just that they're expressly given in the Torah, they are Torah Shebachtav. He's actually saying that the three Moadot, that's Torah Shebachtav. And Torah Shebachtav is, where is it coming from? It's coming from God. V'Chanukah uPurim hey Moadot shezachu lahem b'nei Yisrael b'masayim nikra Torah Shebal Peh. It's fascinating. Because even when you look at the rainbow of learning moves in this same system of partnership. Learning is this system of Brit as well. In the beginning of the Brit, we needed all the help we could get from God. God gives it to us. But then as the Brit evolves, what occurs? Torah Sheba'al Peh means much more is coming from humankind. Chanukah uPurim, Hey Moadot, these are special times that Israel merited by their own deeds. These are called oral Torah. They are witness that Israel chose the Blessed Holy One. Israel are joined to God, and their deeds arouse God. For here they are capable of creating new sacred times by their deeds. So what's true about Pesach and Purim is true about all of the Chagim. I think I've shared with you what I have on my desk. It's a dialogue between two people that speaks to this idea. Two friends were discussing some of the more difficult issues of life. One said, "Sometimes I would like to ask God why He allows poverty, famine, and injustice when He could do something about it. Why does God allow all of this?" The second one says, "Well, why don't you ask God?" And what does the first one respond? "Because I'm afraid that God is going to ask me the same question." That's partnership. Partnership is, when I entered into the rabbinate, just 25 years after the Shoah, people would say, "How could you believe in a God that allowed 6 million to die?" As I get older, that question is unanswerable. But along with that question, somebody has to ask another question. Not only where was God, but where was man? Where was woman? Where were we? Were we doing our share to help ourselves? So that's Brit as partnership. Let me move now to a second piece in Brit. Because here, Brit takes a counterintuitive turn. Because one would suspect that as Am Yisrael assumes more responsibility, and God, if you will, steps back, one would think that one feels God to a lesser degree. You followed that transition? By the way, when you prepare drashot or anything, what's the toughest part? Transitions. Transitions are tough. And transitions have to be seamless. Don't make them complicated. They have to be seamless, moving from one point to another. And they have to be a transition that not only you understand, but that the listener can understand. That's very, very key. So the way I put it is, again, covenant takes a kind of counter turn, because one would expect that as we assume greater responsibility and God is stepping back, that one feels God less. I'm arguing that the opposite is true. So when we become a peoplehood, and here I want to talk about God's presence in covenant. When becoming a peoplehood, God reveals Himself intensely where? Where is God especially revealed to Am Yisrael as a nation for the first time? Intensely. Har Sinai. And after Har Sinai, after we leave Sinai, where does God especially reveal Himself? Mishkan. And after the Mishkan, the Bet HaMikdash. That's where God is especially revealing Himself. Let's take a look at one of the many psukim which is descriptive of how, I'm blocking names. You're?
Victoria.
I'm sorry?
Victoria.
Victoria and
Rory.
And of course Rory. So Rory, could you take it? Vahayam?
Sure.
It's now in your sheets, the back.
Yeah, I don't have the...
It's 2A.
It's presence.
Oh, it's
So it's right
A.
on
It's
the
right-
sediment. Yeah.
Okay. היה המקום אשר יבחר השם אלוקיכם בו, ושכן שמו...
Sham?
Oh, sorry, I got cut. Shama taviu et kol asher anochi mitzaveh.
And there are many variations of this, but it's really the same. And it shall come to place that the place that the Lord God chooses, then, l'shaken shmo sham, to what? The place which God chooses to cause His name to dwell there. Shama taviu et kol asher anochi mitzaveh etchem. There you should bring everything that I command you. So the word shaken, what is it? What is it in that sentence? The place which the Lord your God not choose to cause, won't choose to cause His name to dwell there. To cause His name to dwell there. It's basically a verb. The place where God causes His name to dwell. And you find that throughout the Torah, that God talks about the Mishkan which he chooses, and the Mishkan basically, as Umberto Cassuto says, is the walking Sinai. After we left Sinai, that's the walking Sinai. Now, after the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, the idea of Mishkan, l'shaken shmo, evolves into what word? Into the word Shechina. In fact, Shechina, which is a noun, to my knowledge, Shechina as a name of God never ever appears in the whole Bible. That is really fascinating. We often use the term Shechina. What does Shechina really mean? It means the indwelling. It means the omnipresent. Shechina is from the word shachen, which means neighbor. God is my neighbor. God is everywhere. God is omnipresent. But the word Shechina is post-biblical. Why is that? Why didn't the word Shechina appear in the Torah? So I would argue as follows. The God who particularly appeared in the Mishkan, first at Sinai and in the Mishkan and then in the Bet HaMikdash, manifest as Shechina, literally the indwelling, the God who is omnipresent. The Midrash says, Ein makom panui b'li Shechina, there is no place that is devoid of God. Thus, in this stage, God is not less present, rather God is, in fact, God is more present. You're following the movement here. The movement is that in the beginning of time, where God was more involved, he was intensely involved at Sinai, intensely involved in the Mishkan or in the Bet HaMikdash. Afterwards, there wasn't an intensity in one place, it was more diffuse. And because it was more diffuse, you could feel God, in a certain sense, you can feel that presence more greatly in every place. So there's a magnificent parable that I think sheds light on how in the post-Bet HaMikdash era, there are aspects, even though we're all looking for the Bet HaMikdash to be rebuilt, but there are aspects of the post-temple era that are more conducive to feeling the presence of God. So let's take 2b, let's read it inside. Victoria, would you? Mashal?
Mashal HaMelech, כשהוא בבית מלכותו, כאשר לבוא אליו.
This is written by Rav Gedaliah Shor, who was a rabbi in Torah Das, where I went. I'm not sure they would kind of put my photograph out there as an alumnus, but I did graduate Torah Das elementary school, and Gedaliah Shor was then in the high school, so I didn't know him personally, but this is a magnificent piece. And he's writing about feeling the presence of God after the destruction. He actually writes specifically about Bein HaMetzarim, but it really is the same. You can compare this to a melech, keshehu bevet malchuto. When a king or a queen is in the palace, kasher lavo elav. Very, very difficult to approach him. Try to get beyond the gates of the White House. If you break through there, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, I relate to this very much. I've never, ever been in the Oval Office. Never, ever. It's tough to get in there. It's tough to get in there. It's very difficult. You can't get in. You're surrounded. Now, it's true. I've never confronted a president in the Oval Office, but I've had my great moments with presidents, but never in the White House. Outside of the White House. It's much easier. Much, much, much easier. And that's what he writes. Look at this. Masha Ein Kain.
מה שאין כן כשהמלך נוסע בדרך, אז יכולים כל בני אדם, אפילו אדם פשוט מאוד, לדבר אל המלך.
Oh, once the king leaves and mingles amongst his constituents, it may be possible for the most common person to interact with him. So one of my great moments in life was when Carter, who everyone knows now is really just a horror on Israel, but thank God I knew it back when he was in his in his first years of presidency, he was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan, and they were very careful about who they gave tickets to as he was speaking in Rabbi Ben Zion Boxer Shul in Queens. But I have friends, and I got tickets. So as James Reston wrote the next day, he was a New York Times columnist, he wrote, they gave out the tickets wrong. And when I got my chance, I gave him hell. He stood up, and he was really, in my opinion, he was doing terrible things against Israel, and he really was lifting Arafat, and then the whole world knew Arafat was a terrorist, and I screamed at him, and he looked at me, he tried to stare me down, and I screamed out at him, Carter is a liar. And my mother, blessed memory, lived then in Netanya, and she calls me, and she had a little black and white TV, and she said, Avrami, I only saw your back, but I'm your mommy, and I can recognize it was you. You were screaming at the president. I said, that's right. She said, you were screaming, Carter is a liar, Carter is a liar. I said, Ima, he's a liar. So she said, well, why couldn't you scream, Mr. President? Why don't you tell the truth? That's a mother. I said, Mommy, it doesn't go in the world of activism, and Mr. President, Carter's a liar. It's quick to the point. I relate to this, that you can't get to the person in power when they're sitting there. But when they're out of the Oval Office, it's still tough to get to them because they're still surrounded by secret agents. But you can get near them. You can get there near them. And then he continues, Victoria, going, V'hainu, now he relates it back. Kisman zeh.
והיינו כזמן זה, שגלתה השכינה ממקומה, הרי הוא כמי שהמלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, בדרך. ולכן את רצון.
Isn't that something? And the English go on similarly in this time.
Similarly in this time, when Shekhinah has been exiled from his temple, it is as if the ruler of rulers, the Holy One, blessed be He, roams among his subjects. This is a more favorable time for the average person to gain access.
And it's extraordinary. Let's talk about this for a moment. What is he saying? So too now, after the Galut, after the exile, God is less intensely in the Kodesh Kodashim on top of the Kruvim. God is roaming amongst his subjects. So it is then, as he writes, that it is v'lachen et ratzoni. It's a more favorable time. Isn't that fascinating? V'chol echad yachol litkarev v'lavo el hamelach. Everyone can come close to the king. Yes.
That seems like so interesting, and especially that he's someone so recent, because what we do today is we now glorify the times when there was dafka, a centralized place for God, right? We look to the Beit HaMikdash and to the Mishkan and all that. Like, it's sort of like, I guess we're saying, you don't see what's right in front of you, in a way.
Right. And look, and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash was a very, very bad thing. And we do say, we look for the time of Yibaneh Beit HaMikdash. Mm-hmm. But it is saying that there is, like in all negatives, even in horrific things, there are slivers of positives. And here there's a very, very great positive. There's a positive, I think, in authority not being so centralized, and there's a positive now in that with God, God's presence is more diffuse, and that is a positive, and it's something that we should be talking about. And I think it's a key component in Brit. And my good friend was really today almost like an older brother to me, the older brother I always wanted, Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Greenberg, who's done a lot of work on covenant. He's written a book now, but it's 1,300 pages. He's going to have to. I said, yes, you got to condense it. 1,300 pages. But he offers as only he can a kind of populist way of understanding it. He says, this is his language. He says, in the temple, God's voltage was intense because it was concentrated in one place and more diffuse elsewhere. Hence, you can never get close. Because if you touched it, it's going to give you an electric shock. That's why there's all these halachot, don't get too close, don't get too close. But in the post-temple era, the voltage is less intense, as God's presence is spread out more equally everywhere, making God more accessible, more present. And at the Shabbat Hagadol Drasha, the highlight was, I asked Dr. Gela Fishman, who's a Yiddishist, to read Rav Levi Yitzhak Badichev's poem. He wrote a poem called Do, which is sort of like, it's the second person you, but it's a you, and the you is really a dear friend. It's not like a you. The you is like a person of tremendous authority. It's like, shows a tremendous kinship. And he wrote, the way she stood, and she read this in the Yiddish, as wir geh du, und wir steh du, rak du, no du, vide du, aber du, do, which means wherever I go, you, wherever I stand, you, only you, everywhere you. Is emetsin gut du, chalila shlech du, mizrach du, mariv du, tzafon du, daron du. When I am glad in you and when I am sad in you, only you, everywhere you. Sky is you, earth is you above, you below, in every trend, at every end. Do. Sometimes I think that, I know this is not the kind of fancy thing to say these days, but I think you can only have a real understanding, or I'm going to put it this way, you have a deeper understanding of love of God if you've been in love. I think if you have a human sense of what does it mean when you love someone and always to feel the presence of that someone, it may give a greater glimpse of what it is to feel the presence of God. So that brings us to the third P. We've had partnership, presence, and now potential. And then there is the Brit as potential. Now we've pointed out, what have we said about covenant? Let's review a little bit. We've got about 30 minutes less, we should be able to do it. Covenant is a blueprint which maps out a journey towards redemption. That is what it is. Now, given that God is a partner in that process, given that God is always present, because what we said is that God is a partner, and the more we assume responsibility and God steps back, not the less present God is, the more present is. So given God's partnership and God's presence, so one would imagine that covenant should be void of struggle. Why? Because if God is partnering with me, if God is always present, I should never stumble. There should be no pain. There should be no setbacks. There should be no suffering. And yet the opposite is true. Built into covenant is suffering. Now let's take a look at the sentence, which is in the Baruch Shem Avtachato. It's 3a. This is the sentence quoted in the Haggadah, which deals with the Brit Bein Abtarim. Let's look at these sentences. Miriam, Vayom Ali Avraham.
ויאמר לאברהם ידע תדר כי גר חיים זרחה בארץ לא להם ועבדום ועינו אתם 400 שנה.
God says, you shall surely know that your children will be strangers. Circle the word ger, will be strangers in a land not theirs. Vavadum, circle the word vavadum. They will be avadim, they will be slaves. Ve'inu otam, circle the word inu, they will be afflicted. Arba meyot shana. Then, v'gam et hagoy asher yavodu, right Miriam, dan anochi. I will bring judgment against the people that enslaved you, that afflicted you. V'achrechen yetzu b'chush gadol. But built into the freedom was the suffering. Built into covenant is suffering. And as a matter of fact, when one takes a look at the beginning of Sefer Shmot, take a look at the first few psukim of Sefer Shmot, many of the same words found here in the Brit Bein Abtarim are found in those psukim. For example, the Torah says right in Shmot, Perek Aleph, Vaya'avidu Mitzrayim et b'nei Yisrael b'farach. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. What word jumps out of the page there? Va-ya-avidu. They enslaved them. That is, of course, the parallel. What do you have in the Brit? What word does that parallel? Vavadum. And then it continues and it says, V'chashe yanu oto ken yirbe v'chen yifrotz. The more we were afflicted, the more we multiplied and spread abroad. What word, V'chashe yanu, does that pick up here from the Brit? V'inu. So in the Brit Bein Abtarim, within that covenant, God has said, before you will be free, the passageway to freedom is going to be slavery and is going to be affliction. And those words, slavery and affliction, are found, in fact, in the description of Am Yisrael in Mitzrayim. In fact, the Talmud, when it talks about Geula, quotes a position of Shmuel that Israel's suffering in the exile, in of itself, is enough for redemption. Now, as I said that, there was a person with whom I had great respect who kept shaking his head, no. Because what I've just said now, if we would leave it here, it's just very, very difficult to handle. But obviously this has to be expanded and developed. But at this point, what we're arguing is that suffering itself is enough for redemption. I want to take a look at the Gemara. It's a very important Gemara. One of these Gemaras you should have in your back pocket and always be able to quote. Go ahead, Ruthie. Amarav.
Kulo kol hakitzim.
Right. Kalu kol hakitzim, which means all, kitzim from the word kates. Kalu mean from, all the predestined dates for redemption have passed. You know, there are all kinds of predictions. The Lubavitch Rebbe said, the Mashiach's coming this year, and then you look at the, those Bibles, the fundamentalist Bibles, it's going to happen because you see it in this and this and that. The Gemara says, Kalu kol hakitzim, all those, days that people said that it was going to happen, they've already passed. And what does it say? Ve'ena davar. And the matter now depends upon repentance and good deeds. If we want the Mashiach to come, we've got to do good deeds. Shmuel Amar. Shmuel says, no, it doesn't depend on good deeds. Dayo la'avil sheyamod be'evlo. It is sufficient for a mourner to keep in mourning. The Midrash says that God has like a big vat, gigantic vat, and gathers the tears of the suffering. When the vat will be full, redemption comes. Built into Geula is galut, is suffering. And suffering in of itself is what's going to bring about Geula. Now, the symbol of that suffering, anybody know? In Kabbalistic literature, there is a ritual that is very much symbolic of that suffering. Is none other than Brit Milah, is circumcision. In Kabbalah, Brit Milah is very much associated with this kind of suffering. Circumcision is viewed as the symbol of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, as the innocent, suffering servant. Yeshayahu Nun Gimel. We look at Yeshayahu Nun Gimel as referring to the innocence and the suffering servitude of all of Am Yisrael. And when a child is born, when a son is born, the infant is innocent, quite innocent. And circumcision involves pain. And the child is the ultimate servant of God in his innocence. Brit Milah is the innocent, suffering servant. It's the symbol of that. And in certain ways, circumcision is a microcosm. Anybody tell me of which biblical narrative, one of the most famous? It's the Zer Anpin of none other than Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. The paradigmatic example is when, because in both those cases, there is the father and the son. The mitzvah to circumcise the child is really the father's. The way I couch it is that the father is going to ask the Moa with the permission of his wife to whatever. because this is not always that way, but because there are all kinds of situations. But basically, in both, you have father and son, and a knife is lifted towards the child, and in the end, what happens? The child lives. Yitzchak lives. The child lives. The circumcision performed on the organ of propagation is symbolic of the covenant as being eternal. So the symbol of this suffering is Brit Milah. And this is unbelievable. In Tanakh, it is almost every time that in Tanakh, circumcision always precedes redemption. We're arguing now that suffering is a necessary ingredient before redemption. The symbol, Brit, is always preceding redemption. Probably the most paradigmatic example is when we leave Mitzrayim. Now, when we leave Mitzrayim, we're told to slaughter the Korban Pesach. We take the blood, we put it on the doorpost, and the angel flies over. But there is a magnificent midrash. It's based upon the plurality of dam that says that the dam Pesach was mingled with the dam. Are you aware of this? With the dam of circumcision. It's in Rashi right there in Chumash, Perek Yubet, Perek Yud Gimel. It's found in one of the most prakim in Navi, which you should read in Yecheskel Perek Tet Zayin. Let's take a look at it. Let's take a look now in your sheets at 3C. At 3C. Say Victoria, Uvshnei Damim. Roy, did you read yet?
No.
No, could you mind? Uvshnei Damim.
Uvshnei Damim nitzulu Yisrael mitzrayim. B'dam Pesach or b'dam Milah.
With two bloods will we saved, the Midrash says. Shenema.
Shene'emar va'avor alecha va'ar'eka unis.
Both hard reading. Va'avor, and I passed over you. Va'avor alayich va'ar'ech, and I saw mitboseset b'damayach. I saw you wallowing in your blood. Va'omalach, and I said b'damayach chayi, by your bloods you will live. By your bloods you will live. Notice bloods is in the plural. B'dam Pesach u'v'dam Milah. In other words, the blood of circumcision was mixed with the blood of Pesach, of the Paschal Lamb, and the Exodus could only take place after the circumcision, just as the redemption can only come after the suffering. And this pattern is found elsewhere. For example, in the beginning of Sefer Yoshua enters, and before he begins the liberation of the land, what must happen? Brit Milah. And that impossible narrative, that esoteric incident, Moshe is on his way with his family to Paro to call out Shalach et Ami. Suddenly, what happens? Moshe's child what happens? He can't move forward until the child Tzipporah has to, remember the Malach is about ready to kill the child. And then Tzipporah has to step forth and circumcise the child. Now, what does that have to do with anything? But before Moshe could stand before Paro with that liberating voice of Shalach et Ami, let my people go, what must precede it? Brit Milah has to precede it. It has to precede it. And it has to precede it. So what are we saying about circumcision? We're saying that a circumcision is the symbol of the innocent suffering servant, and suffering is built into covenant. That's why suffering is always preceding Geula. But now I want to turn this, because he can't stop here, as Norman was going, no, please. That can't be. So I want you to hear me now. This is the key move. Suffering in covenant has a much deeper dimension, has much deeper meaning. You know, there's a wonderful story told about the Klosenberger Rebbe. And sometimes hard ideas, this is now Rabbanu Shazachin. Rabbanu Shazachin means this is, talking in the rabbinic, in the spiritual realm of how one can teach a heavy concept. Sometimes it's only through a story. So the Klosenberger Rebbe, have you heard of him? A great Rebbe. He, in the Shoah, have you heard of him, Miriam? He lost his wife and he had 11 children. Every single one was killed in the Shoah. Ultimately, he made his way to Netanya, Israel. He was the one who built Laniado Hospital. You've heard of Laniado. And Kiryat Sanz is his. He's buried in the Bet Almim of Netanya. And I know that cemetery well. My wife's parents are buried there, and my mother. My father served as a rabbi in Shikun Vatikin. My father did maybe well for many years, and my mother is buried in Shikun Vatikin. But before the Klosenberger went to Israel, he came to Israel through America. He spent a very short period of time in America. And there are legends about the Klosenberger in America. And he used to preside over circumcisions. Now this pasuk that you just read, Evor Olayach, and I passed over you. You should take a look at it, Yecheskel Ted Zayin. You have a chance at night before you go to sleep. Maybe not before you go to sleep. You should take a look at it and read that parak. And I said, by your bloods you will live. That is found in the paragraph in which we name a child. Elokeinu ve'elokei avotenu. Kayem et hayeled hazeh la'aviv u'l'imo. V'yikarei shmo b'Yisrael. And then you get down to this pasuk. And everybody was waiting. What will the Klosenberger do when he gets to that pasuk? He was asked to name the child. First child he's naming after the Shoah. How is he going to say these words that I passed over you, God says, and I saw you wallowing in your blood, and I said, by your bloods you will live. A man who lost his wife and 11 children. How is he going to say it? He came to the pasuk and he broke down. I want you to take a look at the paragraph when you get a chance in Brit Milah, you'll see it. He breaks down. And he doesn't go on. And after many moments of sobbing, he goes on. And as was often the case, they come up to him and they said, Rebbe, what was going on in your mind? He said, I kept thinking, by your bloods you will live, by your bloods you will live. After what I've experienced, it's too much. And then he said, I was only able to go forward. Now this is unbelievable. When it dawned upon me that damayich for me doesn't come from the word dam. It doesn't come from the word blood. Rather, it comes from the word damayich belashon dumiyah. What does dumiyah mean? Dumiyah. Amod dom. Dumiyah. Silence. Silence. For the Klosenberger, and for so many others, the suffering was so far-reaching, it was inexplicable. It was beyond comprehension. The only response was to achieve a level of what Rav Kook calls in our Palei Toha, the Kedushat HaDumiyah, the holiness of silence, the holiness of the beyond. And from this perspective, the covenant is not only about suffering. It's deeper than suffering. It's not only about punishment, quite the opposite. Do you know what it's about? It's about opportunity. It's about potential. Now, the Sfat Emet says it very well. Let's turn to the back. This is a magnificent Sfat Emet, Victoria. Let's take a look at it. M'tchila uvdei avodah zara hayu avoteinu. Go on. In the beginning, our answers were idol worshippers. And the basic question, Victoria, of the Sfat Emet here is, if the night of Pesach is about our redemption, why do we have to recall the slavery? Why do we have to recall Maror? Let's talk about the freedom. Let's talk about the redemption. Let's talk about solidarity. Let's talk about, we don't have to talk about all the past stuff. That's what he's asking. Mitchila ovdei avodah zara hayu avoteinu. Perush, go on.
Perush shemazkirin shagalut gam ken hayta latova.
That's worth the price of admission. First of all, he says gam ken. It's very important. This means that we declare that the exile was also for the good purpose. Also, in other words, it had a terrible price, but it also had a good purpose. Why? Ki lo
hayunu mitkarvim la'avodat hamakom rak al yidei galut Mitzrayim nitkarvu
Rav Noe Lav Baruch.
Lav Baruch.
We would not have drawn near to the service of God without the exile in Egypt. Go on. V'lachen maskirim kol zeh. Therefore, we're going to mention it all. Hashibud, the subjugation, Vatzaka, and the cries, Vagula, and the redemption, Shebnei Yisrael mishapchim al kol taluchot hagalut. Israel praises the entire journey of exile. Sha'al yedei zeh, through this, hayab b'chochenu litzok kira'ui l'Hashem yitbarach. Through this, we were able to cry out properly to the Holy One, may be blessed. And look at this last line. Go on. Zeh
Zetam
Hamaror. This is the meaning of maror. Al Shem.
Hashem Shevach Hamarut B'atzma.
Now this is unbelievable. It is a praise of the bitterness itself. A praise of the bitterness itself. There was something praiseworthy about the bitterness. Without the bitterness, there would not have been the ultimate outcome. Now, I want to say this very clearly, and this, hear me well. This doesn't mean that we're looking to suffer. It doesn't mean that the suffering is worth it. You have to be very careful here. It's not that we're looking to suffer, and it's not that I'm looking for a Shoah, and it's not that the Shoah was worth it, because frankly, if you asked me, Medinat Yisrael or the Shoah, I would say it's not worth 6 million. We're not looking. We're not looking for it, and it's not worth it often. What it's saying is that given the suffering, it should be viewed as potential. That's what this is saying. Given the suffering, sure there's suffering, but it should be viewed as potential. And sometimes I think that there were never any great people in the world. There were only great challenges. Given the challenges, people rose to the occasion. Oh, sure, they were great people, but there was no great person in a vacuum. Great people they didn't just come about. They always came about because there was some suffering, some negative out there that they were responding to. Moshe was a great man, absolutely. But why does he achieve greatness? He was responding to slavery. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, he declares Tein li yavne b'chachameha. When? When he recognizes that the destruction of Yerushalayim is imminent. Lincoln was Lincoln because slavery was rampant. Martin Luther King was Martin Luther King, who went to the mountaintop because racism was ravaging this country. Ben Gurion was Ben Gurion. Why? Because the Jewish people desperately needed a homeland. Sharansky was Sharansky, and he spent those years in the Gulag because he looked around and his people weren't free, and he was raising a powerful voice of moral conscience. The greatness of all of these people did not emerge in a vacuum, but as a response to the potential inherent in covenant. So built, let me just to summarize where we've been. Covenant is, let's summarize. Covenant, who's involved in covenant? Two parties, God and the human being. It's a partnership. And as we mature, God steps back. That's the partnership. Second step, because God steps back doesn't mean that there's less of a presence of God, rather there is more of a presence. And thirdly, because of not despite God's partnership and presence, that doesn't mean that there aren't moments of real pain and suffering. Built into covenant is suffering. But the key is, are we to view that suffering as punishment or as opportunity? And what we're suggesting is the suffering in covenant is deeper than the suffering. It's the Kedushat HaDumiyah. It's the suffering of opportunity. Of opportunity. But I've got to expand on this even further, because sometimes the recognition of potential in covenant doesn't occur in the generation of those who are suffering. Sometimes it only evolves later, sometimes even in the next generation. Let's think about this for a moment. Let's go back to Yetziat Mitzrayim. If this position is correct, that suffering is built into it, but suffering is potential, is opportunity, one would imagine that who would recognize that it's opportunity? The people who suffered. But that's not the case. The generation that was in Egypt, well, when you think about them, first of all, most of them didn't want to leave Egypt. The Torah says Vachamushim. The Medrash says Vachamushim means only 1/5 of the Jews left. And of those who left, Ki Gorshumi Mitzrayim, they had to be pushed out of Egypt. And when they left, all over Bamidbar, what do they want to do? They want to go back. In the Parshat Mitonin, in Perek Yud Aleph Bamidbar, Zachanu et hadaga shenochal b'Mitzrayim. Oh, could you imagine? We remember the fish. Chinam, it was for free. Et hakishuim, we remember the cucumbers. They were delicious. Ve'et ha'avatichim, we remember the melons. Ve'et hachatzir, we remember the leeks. Ve'et ha'btsalim, we remember the onions. Ve'et hashumim, we remember the garlic. It's great food. We want to go back to Egypt. And then in the Parshat Meraglim, what do they say? Nitna rosh v'nashuva mitzrayma. We want to head and let us go back. We want to go back to Egypt. The truth of the matter is that the Jews who left Egypt never once saw themselves as strangers in Egypt. They never did. They didn't see themselves as Gerim. Gerut is a subjective feeling dealing with one's sense of having different values, a different destiny, you feel like you're a ger when you feel you don't belong in the country where you're living. The generation that left Egypt never described themselves as strangers in Egypt because they never viewed themselves as gerim. They didn't see the suffering as potential to create something different. They never recognized the fullness of the covenant. They suffered, but they were a generation that never saw potential in that suffering. That was left for whom? Who saw potential in that suffering? First of all, you're right, Moshe did. Moshe does call his son Gershon, Ki Ger Hoyidi, but the people never use that term. As a people, it's the next generation. It's only the next generation. Paradoxically, only the generation not there could understand the full significance of being there. Slaves who were there couldn't comprehend the meaning of the Exodus. Only a free people who had the perspective of hindsight could. Those who left didn't see the potential in the suffering. The second generation recognized that Egypt was punishment. Wasn't punishment, but opportunity. And so in the Haggadah, if you look at the front page, after the paragraph of Brit, and after the paragraph of V'hisha Amdal Avotenu, that it's the Brit which has sustained us, we then learn Arami Oved Avi. Arami Oved Avi, if you look at this, Arami, these sentences, where do they come from? This is the essence of the Haggadah. Where do they come from? They do not come from, you're right, they do not come, Victoria, from Shmot, they come from Devarim. They're said by the children of those who left Egypt, that then the generation that would enter Israel, they understood the meaning of the Exodus in ways that the first did not. Only they could say that they were there. Let's look at those sentences very, very quickly, because my time is running out. I have just one more small piece here. Arami Oved Avi, a wandering Aramean was my father, referring either to Yaakov or maybe to Avraham, Vayered Mitzrayma. Now this is being said at the end of Dvarim by the person who would bring Bikurim. Vayagar Sham, he was a stranger there. It's only the second generation who can understand that my father was a ger. Next sentence, Vayareu otanu Mitzrim vayanunu, and they dealt ill with us. Vayanunu, there's the word, they afflicted us. Vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha, and they placed upon us hard labor. We became slaves. So it's only that generation, the second generation, that could in fact proclaim we were there. Let's take a look at the writings of Rabbi David Silber, page 4, number E. So, Miriam, do you want to take it? The Torah seems...
The Torah seems to be suggesting that the people who actually witnessed the Exodus and stood at Sinai were not fully there.
Right, that the people who witnessed the exile and stood at Sinai, they were not fully there. They were not fully there. In the sense
that they never understood.
They never understood, right, or internalized.
The experience. The people who left Egypt and stood at Sinai were the ones who made the golden calf and wanted to return
Right.
to their place.
Right. They didn't even recognize they were at Sinai. They built a golden calf. They didn't recognize they were in Egypt. They wanted to return. Deuteronomy, on the other hand, referring now to the Parsha Bikurim, go on, addresses.
And this is the people who were not physically present at those.
Right. This is being said to that second generation. The generation
The generation that was never in Egypt and was therefore able to attain critical distance from the experience.
Wow, once they had distance from the slavery, they could look back and say, aha, that was slavery. To these people,
The Torah says it's because you were not in Egypt that you can understand Egypt. It is because you were not there that you were
as if there. Now, I just want to add one last thing, and then we're going to finish. Because when David says that, I hear it. But when I look at Miriam, for example, I've heard Miriam speak about communism. And Miriam, in a certain sense, you experienced the communism on some level. When I think about who experienced Mitzrayim in our generation, frankly, a Mitzrayim that was more than a Mitzrayim, who would it be? Who were those who experienced? I think the survivors of the Holocaust. They experienced Egypt. Mitzrayim's from the language of Mitzarim and Ametza Karatika. And the reality is, wait a minute, we're saying that built into covenant is suffering, but it should be a suffering where I can see. We don't look for it, it's not worth it, but within the suffering, once it's there, I should see potential. Sometimes the generation that's there doesn't see the potential, only the next generation. I look at the survivors, some of the most eloquent witnesses of what occurred in the Shoah is that first generation. Is the generation that was there, and then something hit me. Now really open your hearts. The truth is that from 1945 and for many years, decades, the survivors couldn't speak. They couldn't speak. That's the darn truth. Now, the survivors have impacted my rabbinate in a profound way. We were the Bet Knesset of never again. That's why I built the shul. I was driven by it. Everything we did was, right? Something went wrong, we were out there protesting. But for 20 years, they didn't speak. And in speaking to these survivors whom I love, they would say to me, we were so traumatized. We were so in pain. We couldn't talk. And there's a woman, Rose Feigenbaum, she buried her husband. They're in their 80s. She told me this is the first time she was sitting Shiva. She lost who knows how many relatives. She never said Shiva. When I said to her, Makom Yenachem Otach, she said to me, and I gave her all kinds of drushes on Hamakom. She says, no. You know what Hamakom means? I have a grave I can go to. I never had a grave. For many years, the survivors couldn't talk. Couldn't talk. Couldn't talk. Some of them felt shame. Why did I survive? The others didn't survive. Guilt, believe it or not, all kinds of feelings. All kinds of feelings. But something...
It is very hard to really, until you don't have your own children adult enough, can understand. And
I think that's true too. Well, that's true. But when did they start speaking?
The next generation. When the next generation actually came.
But the next generation was being born. I think the survivors started to speak a little bit when Eichmann was brought to trial. A little bit. but I'm convinced, you know when it happened? If you look at modern Holocaust testimony, it's like a flood of water that gushes after Milchemet Sheshet HaYamim. I really think that was the turning point. After Milchemet Sheshet HaYamim, when Am Yisrael and the survivors experienced the euphoria of Israel reborn, only then could the survivors look back and talk forthrightly, eloquently about what had occurred. Only when feeling truly liberated were they inspired to tell their stories. Look at the last piece. Not coincidentally, Ruth, do you want to take it? The text of the Haggadah.
Sure. The text in the Haggadah of Rav Avi, which offers first-hand testimony of the horrors of Egypt, was said by the Jewish farmer in Israel when bringing the first fruits to the temple. Never once in Chumash do the people who left Egypt talk about their slavery and persecution in Egypt. Never once do they declare Avadim
Never once.
Hayinu.
Never once did they say Avadim Hayinu. The ones who will say it, it's not just that it's the second generation. It's the second generation who what? Who's entering into Israel, who feels the liberation. Go on, it was only
their children, after entering Israel and settling the land and bringing the first fruits, who would declare, we were strangers, we were enslaved in a
That's the Arami Oved Avi. Go on, it was then.
It was then, as a free people, that we learned the secret of covenant, that even in suffering there is opportunity.
Right, and for you, your Talmidot Chachamot, I want you to know that Arami Oved Avi is what the Jews should say when they bring Bikurim in Israel, but it's not as if they're saying it at that moment. If you take a look at Yoshua, Perek Chav Dalid, which is actually quoted in the Haggadah, that's Yoshua's farewell address. And it is there that Yoshua gives his farewell address and says the land has been liberated. And then, look at Perek Chav Dalid, Vayan Ha'am, the people respond, you're right. We were Gerim in Mitzrayim. Only when liberated, only after the liberation, could they say we were Gerim. And then Yehoshua, at the end of Perek Chav Dalid, Vayichrot Brit, he establishes the covenant. The covenant has been fulfilled. That's why in Haggadah, Mitchila hayu ovdei avodah zara, v'achshav kirvanu hamakom lavodato, it doesn't mean, people think it means, oh, before we used to be idol worshippers, now God took us close to Sinai. I don't believe that's what it means. Because it quotes Yoshua, the Yoshua text is now God brought us into Israel. Only as a free people in Israel, feeling that freedom, could we look back as a free people, and could we understand the secret of covenant, that even in suffering, there is opportunity. Someone came up to me after this Shabbat Hagadol drasha and said, you know, I am a former addict. Two people told me this. One addiction to drugs, one addiction to alcohol, and said, I couldn't understand the horror of what it was to be an addict until I was able to extricate myself. It's not just in the hindsight, but it's a second generation, or in our case of the survivors, it was a first generation that had experienced the euphoria of the freedom. Because Gerut, as I said to you, is a very subjective term. It's only then they could look back and say, aha, may we be spared. But those moments had a certain positive. You know, right after Rami Oved Avi, we say the Rabban Gamliel about Pesach Matzah and Morah. Something hit me that got me very excited. I was always troubled by the sequence of Pesach Matzah and Morah. Because sequentially, what should come first? Morah. It was bitter. Then what should come next? Pesach. The angel flew over us, we left. And then matzah. When we left, we ate matzot. Why is it Pesach, Matzah, and Morah? I'd like to suggest that our observation teaches that Pesach and matzah come first, as only one who has experienced the freedom of Pesach and matzah can understand the meaning of Morah. Are you with me? You can't get Morah, what it really means, until you've gone through Pesach and Matzah. Only when free can one be cleansed of feelings of victimization and have the strength to look back and see potential that grew out of suffering. So there you have covenant. And covenant's a very central piece in whatever you do in your spiritual leadership. It's covenant as partnership, covenant as presence, covenant as potential. I closed the Shabbat Hagadol drasha by I read from there's a manuscript that someone very close gave to me and asked that I not mention the name, the writer, but this person calls it Psalm songs. It's not a translation of the Psalms, but it's a interpretation of the Psalms, and it's touched me very, very deep. And when I read about it, I think about people who are really in need of eternal covenant, who are in need of a Yeshua. There's a story that a doctor who was davening at the early tefillah, I don't use the term minyan for different reasons, but davening at an early tefillah, I want to make sure women are welcome too, so we use the term tefillah. And he came up to me and he said that he has a close friend, lost his wife to a terrible cancer. And at the Shiva, he had taken wonderful care of her. He came up to me, the doctor said to him, and said that he learned that from this event, that even the Malach HaMavet can be a Malach. Think about that for a minute. Even the Malach HaMavet can be a Malach. Anyway, I close with just reading this, her interpretation of B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, since it's found all the way at the end of the Magid. Oh, this takes you straight through the Magid, what we've been talking about. It's all beautiful, but the last part of B'tzeit Yisrael is Ha'hofchi Atzura Gamayim, who turns the rock into a pool of water, Chalamish Lamayin Omayim, a flint into a flowing stream. So this is her interpretation of B'tzeit Yisrael. She wrote, when Israel escaped from Egypt, songs of Jacob fleeting, flying, cruelty pursuing in the dead heat, they made it home to Israel, a holy land, as a sovereign people bowing to God's rule. The raging sea became a path to shelter them and guide them out. The rivers ran upstream, and rocky mountains leapt like rams to heed the will of God. What is real? What's miracle? Did nature change its course? Did mountains leap? Did rivers run amok? The Lord of all creates his laws and has the power to bend his laws. And then she wrote, on the rock being turned into water, to melt a rock-hard cancer mass, converting it to water. Just very powerful interpretation, to melt a rock-hard cancer mass, converting it to water. So with that, I know I'm 10 minutes late. I wish you a Chag Kasher Sameach. And I'll put over your email site just, and if you have any insights on this, I'd appreciate it, because I hope to publish this and would love to get your critical feedback. It would mean a great deal to me. Enjoy Pesach, and I hope to be here more often now. I've told Rabbi Fox and Rabbi Sarah that it's something I really want to do much more of.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is that your recorder or is it school? Okay, so then
I want to.
how do we stop?